When a door refuses to lock, what is it trying to keep in or out? Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. Drop a comment with your location. I'm always fascinated by where you're tuning in. Your responses turn this channel into something truly special. Let's step inside. It had been raining since before dawn. The grey morning slipped past the tall windows of the Maigrets' apartment like a ghost with nowhere to go. Raindrops skated down the panes in long, lazy trails, and the scent of wet pavements and old stone hung in the air like a forgotten song. Chief Inspector Maigret sat at the breakfast table, a half-smoked pipe resting in his hand, the tobacco now cool and damp. Across from him, Madame Maigret poured his second cup of coffee, setting it beside his folded newspaper without a word. "You're not expected at the Quai des Orfèvres?" she asked, her voice warm, familiar. "I sent Lapointe early." "Nothing pressing," he replied, not looking up. His gaze was fixed on a single drop of water tracing its way down the outside of the glass. "Though I'll go in soon." "You slept poorly." "I dreamed of the Rive Gauche, the time we stayed there before the war." "Do you remember? That tiny hotel near the Jardin des Plantes?" She smiled faintly. "With the maid who always hummed Verdi." He nodded, then fell silent again. The pipe he had forgotten to relight lay idle on the table. The rain thickened against the glass. There was no urgency to the day, no summons. No inspector knocked at the door with a folder of photographs or a body found in some cellar. Just rain, memory, and a vague unease that Maigret couldn't quite name. His phone rang at 9:47. He lifted the receiver slowly, as if expecting something trivial. But the voice on the other end was familiar, one he hadn't heard in some time. Inspector Fumel from the 11th arrondissement. "Maigret? Sorry to bother you at home. There's something odd over at Rue Popincourt. A woman called in from a boarding house, not a murder, not yet anyway, just she says the door to one of the rooms won't lock." "That's police business." "No, that's the thing. The door was locked, she says, but now it won't stay closed. Keep swinging. Open. The tenant's not inside, vanished sometime last night. Left everything behind. Coat, wallet, even his shoes." Maigret said nothing for a moment. Then he stood, the pipe left forgotten once more. "I'll come." By the time he reached the sidewalk, the rain had softened to a drizzle, a thin mist that made the street lamps flicker like gaslight. He walked past the café on the corner where the waiters knew his name, and nodded without speaking. The street smelled of fresh baguettes and wet coal. A boy on a bicycle splashed through a puddle, trailing echoes down the block. There were no sirens, no commotion, just the quiet tension that sometimes came before a story chose to show itself. The boarding house at 43 Rue Popincourt was a narrow 5-story building with chipped green paint and rusted metal letters over the door. Pension, La Pointe. The concierge, Madame Barrel, met him in the lobby, her cardigan mismatched and her lipstick applied unevenly in haste. "He's gone," she said without greeting. "Just gone. And the door won't lock." Maigret followed her up the staircase, his feet silent on the worn red carpet. "Third floor, room 7. The hallway smelled of cabbage and floor polish." She paused, pointing at the half-closed door. It sat awkwardly in the frame, slightly ajar, the latch clicking uselessly as she demonstrated. "See? It was always stiff before. You had to jiggle the handle just right. Now nothing. Won't stay shut." Maigret stepped forward and touched the wood. The lock had been forced, but not with violence. Not broken, just interfered with. He pushed the door open and entered slowly. The room was small and sparse. A narrow bed with a sagging mattress, a table with a cracked porcelain cup still half full of tea, an ashtray containing 3 smoked cigarettes, Gauloises, crushed flat. A worn coat hung neatly on the wall hook, shoes by the door, a shaving kit untouched on the sill. Everything suggested someone had planned to return, and yet the silence was too complete. "His name?" Maigret asked. "Léo Dandurand," she said, "a 42, quiet, rented monthly, paid in cash, no visitors." "No occupation?" "Said he was a translator. I never saw him work." Maigret ran a finger along the windowsill. Dusty, except for a clean streak left by a fingertip. Someone had been looking out recently. "What made you call the police?" he asked. She hesitated, fiddling with her hands. He always locked his door, always. "I cleaned the floors in the morning, and when I passed by today, it was open like this. I knocked, no answer. I waited, still nothing, so I pushed it. That's when I saw the coat and the wallet on the table. People don't go out without their shoes in this weather, do they?" "No," Maigret said gently. "They don't." He stepped to the window and looked out. The narrow courtyard was empty, save for a pigeon nesting above the drainpipe. Rain traced silver lines across the tiles. "What else?" she swallowed. "It's silly, but there's a man who came by last night, just after 9. I saw him from the stairwell. Didn't go in the room, just stood outside, then he left." Maigret turned. "What did he look like?" "Old coat. Tall." "Not one of ours." "Not one of ours," Maigret echoed. That could mean 1,000 things, but she meant it with certainty. This wasn't a neighbor, wasn't one of the drifting lodgers or nearby grocers. The man had no context. Maigret looked again at the room. Nothing was wrong, and yet everything felt off. The cup of tea, cold undrunk, the cigarettes and too many for one evening, the shoes and too dry, the silence, unnatural. He didn't take notes. He didn't ask for evidence bags. He stood there, breathing in the air of a vanished presence. Outside, the door swung slightly again, clicking softly. That's when Maigret's brow furrowed. "He never left the building," he murmured. And with that, the quiet unease of the morning sharpened into something colder, something more deliberate. The hallway smelled faintly of floor wax and something old, something buried in the walls of all these pension houses. The scent of too many quiet years and the people who spent them behind closed doors. Maigret stood for a moment outside room 7, letting the air settle around him like dust. The concierge, Madame Barrel, had gone back to her post downstairs, muttering something about stew on the stove and not wanting to be in anyone's way. Maigret doubted that was true. In his experience, concierge liked to be very much in the way when something out of the ordinary happened, but he let her go. She'd return soon enough, probably with a tidier version of her story and more questions than answers. He lit his pipe, standing just beside the creaking banister that led to the upper floors. He didn't knock on any doors right away. Instead, he waited, listening to the silence that had its own rhythms. Water clinking through the old plumbing, a distant radio murmuring behind a closed door, someone coughing twice on the 4th floor. Then footsteps above. Not heavy, but unhurried, deliberate. A man's stride. Maigret made his way up. The 4th floor corridor was narrower, a little darker. The carpet is more worn. There were only 3 rooms up here, numbers 8 through 10, with faded numbers painted directly on the doors. The footsteps had come from room 9. Maigret knocked gently. The door opened just a crack. A face peered out, thin, grey around the temples and pale in the way of men who spent most of their days indoors. He looked at Maigret without fear, but also without curiosity, as if the presence of a man in a hat and overcoat in a boarding house on a rainy morning was not unusual, only inconvenient. "Yes," the man said, voice dry, lips barely moving. "I'm Chief Inspector Maigret. I'm looking into the absence of your neighbor from downstairs, Monsieur Dandurand from room 7. The man opened the door another inch, enough for Maigret to see the threadbare scarf around his neck. A green wool knit, Too heavy for indoors. Too worn to be decorative. I didn't know him, the man said. Hardly saw him. Still, I'd like to speak with you for a moment. The man stepped aside without further protest. The room was neat, not clean, not polished or dusted, but organized in a way that suggested someone who liked boundaries. The books were arranged alphabetically on 2 makeshift shelves. The curtains were drawn just enough to admit light without exposure. A small kettle steamed on a portable burner near the sink. No smell of food, no sign of another presence. The scarf-wearing man gestured to the one available chair. "Would you like tea?" "No, thank you." "I'm Jacques Letellier. Been here 5 years." He sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded on his knees. "Quiet place, I like it that way." Maigret studied him for a moment. Not suspicious, not yet, but guarded. Letellier's eyes did not rest. They moved between Maigret's pipe, his coat, the window, the floor. "You said you didn't know Dan Durand, but surely you crossed paths." "On the stairs sometimes. He never said more than good evening. A quiet man, dressed well, never made noise." "Did you see or hear anything unusual last night?" Letellier hesitated. A small gesture, a twitch at the corner of his mouth. The kind that passed unnoticed unless one lived, as Maigret did, by watching people fail to lie properly. "I heard someone come up around 9. Didn't see who. Steps on the landing, that's all." "No voice, no knock on your door?" "No." Maigret let the silence stretch. He knew how to use quiet like a rope, not to strangle, but to test. For tension. Letellier finally looked him in the eyes. "I heard someone go down again later. 9:30, maybe closer to 10. "A single set of steps?" "I think so. Not Dan Durand." "I assumed it was." "I didn't go to check." Maigret nodded. The answers were ordinary, reasonable, yet too careful. "Do you always wear the scarf indoors?" Letellier blinked, then smiled faintly. "Habit. Bad throat." "Has it been acting up recently?" Letellier stood. "I should get back to my reading, Inspector." Maigret stood too. He said nothing else, no accusations, no warnings, just a small nod and a glance at the scarf again before stepping out. In the hallway, the sound of a vacuum cleaner started below, humming up through the floorboards. Maigret walked slowly down 1 level and paused before room 6. He knocked, a woman answered. Mid-40s, hair up in curlers despite the late hour. She wore a housecoat and held a cigarette between 2 fingers like a woman born to it. Her eyes flicked up and down Maigret's frame. "You're the policeman?" "Maigret, may I suppose?" The room was the opposite of Letellier. Cluttered, perfumed, faintly theatrical. A heavy red curtain partitioned a makeshift vanity area. Magazines were stacked on the bed. A cat slept on a windowsill. The woman sat back down in a velvet chair and crossed her legs. "Estelle Morgat. I work nights. Dan Durand was below me. He never caused trouble." Maigret stayed near the door. "What kind of work, Madame Morgat?" "Singer. Not the grand kind. Louche cafés, Montreuil, sometimes Belleville. Tips, mostly." "Did you see anything last night?" "I got back around 11. The hall was empty. His door was shut. I didn't hear anything." "No one lingering on the stairs? No voices through the floorboards?" "If there were, I wouldn't have noticed." "I had. A headache. Took something. Slept like the dead." Her gaze lingered on Maigret's hands, then his eyes. "You think something's happened to him?" "I don't know yet." She stubbed the cigarette. "He wasn't the type to disappear. Always left the light on. Always locked up. You'd hear the key turn. Have you noticed anyone new visiting the building recently? Anyone not from here?" She shook her head. "No one I'd remember." Maigret thanked her and moved on. Room 5 was empty. The door bore a note in blue ink. "Gone for week. Lion." Room 4 was answered by a man in suspenders who squinted at Maigret as if the detective were a tax collector. He claimed to have heard nothing and cared even less. As Maigret made his way back down to the third floor, the door to room 7 still hung ajar. He stepped inside once more. Everything was unchanged. And yet, he moved to the desk and opened the single drawer. Inside was a notebook, plain, the kind used for grocery lists or notes. Flipping through it, Maigret saw only translations, pages and pages of sentences, French into German, German into French, underlined words, arrows, definitions. But one phrase stood out, copied 3 times across 2 pages in 3 different inks. La porte refuse de se fermer. La porte refuse de se fermer. La porte refuse de se fermer. The door refuses to close. It was either an exercise or something else. Maigret closed the drawer and looked again at the unlatched door. The hallway beyond seemed darker now, though the same light flickered overhead. He took a final glance at the untouched shoes, then stepped out and closed the door gently behind him. It didn't catch. The lock slid uselessly in place, refusing to engage. Downstairs, Madame Barrel was on the telephone, whispering, not knowing he could hear. "Yes, the inspector's still here. No, I haven't told him yet. No, I don't know where the scarf went." Maigret raised an eyebrow. Then he walked out into the drizzle, pipe unlit, hands buried in his coat, thoughts circling like smoke that refused to rise. The afternoon had not grown brighter. The rain had lightened to a mere mist, but it clung to every surface and made the air feel close, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Maigret sat in the small café opposite the boarding house, a modest place with plastic-covered menus and a steam-clouded window facing Rue Popincourt. He hadn't ordered anything yet. The waitress knew him by sight, but she understood the mood. She simply nodded and left him to his own time. Inside his coat pocket, the small notebook from room 7 sat folded in 2, its spine beginning to bend. La porte refuse de se fermer. The phrase had stayed with him since he left the pension, not just the words, but their rhythm. It had the tone of something personal, a statement, perhaps even a confession, though veiled in grammar and translation. Maigret had seen too many quiet, peculiar details like this to ignore it. It was the kind of thing people left behind, unconsciously, a message without intending it to be one. He finally ordered a beer. The waitress brought it without a word. Across the street, the green door of Pension La Pointe stood still, not quite closed, not quite open. By the time Maigret returned, the front hall was empty again. Madame Barrel was no longer on the phone. She was sitting at the small desk near the mail slots, flipping absently through an old magazine, her expression studiously neutral. "You were on the telephone earlier," Maigret said casually, as he removed his coat and gave it a shake. She looked up too quickly, then caught herself and tried to smile. "Yes, I was just my cousin. She wanted a stew recipe for lentils." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "It's just," she continued, "you seemed very interested in the scarf." "I didn't mention it." Her lips parted, then pressed together. She looked down at the magazine. "Oh, I must have heard wrong. You said something about not knowing where it went." Madame Barrel let out a nervous laugh, not quite a chuckle, but more a sound to fill the space. "Only that. I'd noticed it was gone from the peg. Room 9, Letellier. He always left it on the hook by his door. But this morning it wasn't. There. Probably nothing. Probably." Maigret turned and looked toward the staircase. "How long has Letellier been here?" 5 years, maybe more. Keeps to himself. Pays on time, don't make trouble." "Do you know what he does?" "Claims to be retired. I don't think he's ever said from what. He reads a lot, quiet as a mouse." "And the others, Madame Maigret?" "Oh, she's loud but harmless, hasn't had a proper job in years, but she manages. The others come and go. Monsieur Broussac from room 4 works in delivery. Always exhausted. He's not mixed up in anything. And the empty room, she blinked. Oh, you mean room 5. Monsieur Granier, off visiting his sister in Lyon. He's an archivist, neat as a pin. Left Monday. Maigret let her speak. She wasn't lying exactly, but she wasn't telling everything either. Her fingers tapped nervously against the magazine now. She wanted to please him, or at least avoid his disapproval, but she was also trying to protect the little world of her building. He took a breath. Has there ever been trouble here? Not the kind you'd need to worry about, she said, almost defensively. The occasional noise complaint. Once someone left a burner on, but no, Inspector. This isn't that kind of house. He left her then, moving slowly up the staircase again. The light changed slightly with each floor, duller, more jaundiced, until the 5th floor felt like the attic of some forgotten novel. He paused outside room 5, still locked, the note still in place. Gone for week. Lion. The hallway held nothing, no sound, no smell, only the whisper of wind sneaking through the old wood frames of the windows. Downstairs, he found himself in the small communal kitchen. Most of the boarders kept hot plates in their rooms, but the kitchen was still used, especially for coffee and idle conversation. A cracked window let in the wet air. A single bulb hung overhead, yellow and humming faintly. There was a man there already, slender, bearded, middle-aged. He was rinsing out a chipped teacup, his sleeves rolled up and damp at the elbows. He didn't. Turned when Maigret entered. Coffee's cold, the man said. Has been since morning. I'm not here for coffee, the man turned then, eyes dark and tired. I know who you are, the landlady said. Your name? Alain Broussac. Room 4. Maigret nodded. I understand you work in deliveries? That's right. I leave early, get back late. I don't hear much and I don't ask questions. Did you see Monsieur Dondurand last night? No. I was home by 10. His door was shut. Did you ever speak to him? Only once. Helped him bring in a package about a month ago. Heavy box. Books, I think. Did he seem troubled? Broussac shrugged. I wouldn't know. He was polite. Quiet. Bit jumpy, maybe. Jumpy? Well, he always looked behind him. Not nervously, but habitually. Like someone who expects to be followed. Maigret leaned on the edge of the sink. And the others here, Letellier, Morgat? Letellier is a cold fish. Morgan is noisy. She likes to pretend this place is still in the theatre district. Letellier, I don't know, he's the kind of man who measures his tea. That's all I'll say. And Madame Barrel? She keeps the place together. Likes her order. Knows. Too much. Says too little. Maigret's eyes flicked to the kettle. Still warm, though the flame was off. Were you here this morning? Only briefly. Dropped my coat, made coffee and left again. Didn't see anyone. Maigret looked at him for a moment, then straightened. If you think of anything else, let me know. He left Broussac behind and returned to the stairwell. Still no noise. The door to room 7 hadn't moved, but the air around it felt different, heavier, as if it remembered things people preferred to forget. He stood outside room 9 again. Letellier's door. This time he didn't knock. He listened. No movement. He pressed his ear to the wood. Nothing. Then he looked down. The peg beside the door, where the scarf had hung the day before, now had something else. A small scrap of wool, caught on the corner, like it had been torn. Hastily green Letellier's scarf. Maigret's eyes narrowed. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a match. He lit it, let it flicker, then waved it out. The smoke curled upward. Stillness. The building was old, but it held secrets well, and secrets, Maigret knew, always found their way into the pipes, the dust, and the cracks in doors that wouldn't lock. The late afternoon light had gone grey again. The rain that had briefly thinned now returned with an insistent whisper against the roof tiles and courtyard stones, wrapping the pension in a hush. Maigret stood on the third-floor landing, his coat collar still damp, his pipe unlit in his hand. He stared at the splinter of green wool caught on the peg by Letellier's door, no larger than a fingernail. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. Letellier hadn't left his room since their earlier conversation, at least not by the front stair. That much Maigret would have known. He had a way of listening to buildings as much as people. The creak of wood, the groan of plumbing, the slight tremor of a step taken at the wrong time of day. The boarding house was an organism of habits, and when someone strayed from their pattern, even subtly, the whole place seemed to stiffen. He walked down one flight and stood again before room 7. The door was closed now, not locked, of course, since the latch no longer held, but pulled tight enough to pretend. Inside, the air was stale. It smelled faintly of tea leaves and damp wool. Maigret didn't switch on the light. He let the gloom remain, as if that might help Dandurand's absence say something. He sat on the edge of the bed, which sagged deeply under his weight. The bed springs groaned. He opened the notebook again. The handwriting was controlled, neat but with irregular slants, not the handwriting of a native French speaker. German, perhaps? There was something clipped in the angles of the script. Dandurand had copied the same sentence over and over. La porte refuse de se fermer. He had stopped mid-page. The rest of the notebook was blank. Maigret leaned back and looked up at the ceiling, where a single cobweb fluttered in the draught from the hallway. The quiet pressed around him, not oppressive, not heavy, just the kind that makes a man remember every noise he ever ignored. The footsteps came softly, not from the stairs, not from above, from the service corridor, the narrow one behind, the kitchen, used by cleaning girls long gone and now mostly forgotten. It connected to the back staircase. Maigret stood quietly and moved toward the door, which still wouldn't lock. He opened it a fraction and listened. The sound had stopped. Then, the faintest scrape of a shoe. He stepped into the hallway. The electric light overhead buzzed, the bulb flickering slightly. Maigret walked slowly toward the end of the corridor where the service stair twisted down in narrow stone curves. He descended without sound, his hand barely brushing the wall for balance. At the bottom, a sliver of light showed under the door to the cellar. He paused, listening. Nothing. He pushed the door open. The cellar smelled of coal dust and wet cement. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly. Maigret stepped down carefully. The coal bin was still half full. On the other side, beside the water heater, sat an old wooden chair. On the floor beside it, a footprint. Faint, but unmistakably wet, a man's shoe, not heavy boots, a walking shoe damp on the soles. Maigret crouched. There were no others. Only one person had been down here recently. He heard the stairs creak above him, not from the front stair, from the back. He rose slowly and walked back up, not rushing, not trying to catch anyone, only to see what the house was saying in its hushed movements. Back in the main corridor, the hallway was empty, but at the far end, room 6 stood open. Madame Morgan stood in the doorway, a shawl around her shoulders, cigarette dangling loosely from her lips. Who were? You following? She asked without a smile. No one, Maigret said. She puffed and narrowed her eyes. You always say that when you've just missed something, I was thinking. You were down in the cellar. I was. She tilted her head. You think Dandurand went down there? I don't know. I heard you come back in. I thought maybe you'd finally found a clue. Would you like me to announce every clue I find? She smirked, then grew serious. I didn't see him leave, Inspector. I didn't hear anything last night. But I did notice one thing this morning. Maigret waited. The cat wouldn't. Go near his door, mine. Usually she likes to wander, smells the milk in the kitchen, noses through his shoes. But today, she wouldn't go near it, just sat at the top of the stairs watching. Animals notice things, Maigret said, more than we give them credit for. Maigret exhaled smoke and leaned against the doorframe. Do you believe something happened there, that someone made him disappear? I don't know yet. He wasn't a man who looked like he'd run, but he didn't seem safe either. Maigret studied her. What do you mean? She looked down, fiddling with the filter of her cigarette. He checked his pockets often. You know the type? As if to make sure nothing had vanished. Nervous, yes, but not about money. About something else. Something inside him, maybe. Maigret nodded as if confirming a note in his mind. Did he talk to you? No, but he listened at the doors. I saw him once, not close from the stairwell. His shadow under Letelier's door. It was late, and he wasn't making noise, just standing there, listening. That hung in the air. Did you mention that to anyone? Who would care? Maigret turned back toward the stair. Thank you, Madame Maigret, she called after him, voice softening. He wasn't cruel, you know. Just lost. Back in the lobby, Madame Baril was rearranging the mail slots, pretending to clean. Maigret crossed to her without speaking. She straightened at once. Did Dandurand receive many letters? Few. Fewer than most. Did he send any? She hesitated. Once a week, always the same, a pale blue envelope, hand-addressed, stamped with care. I posted them myself. Where to? She looked flustered. I never checked. Madame Baril, Maigret said gently, but with enough pressure to halt her. She relented. Germany, Frankfurt, I remember, because it was always that. Never changed. Maigret nodded. Do you still have one of the envelopes? She opened her drawer and retrieved a crumpled bit of paper, the corner torn, the address smudged. But yes, Frankfurt, a woman's name. No return address. He turned the envelope over in his hand. The paper had been scented, lavender, faint. But there, he pocketed the scrap and thanked her. That evening, as the sky darkened and the drizzle returned in full, Maigret stood beneath the awning across from the boarding house once more. The street lamps shimmered through the wet glass of the cafe window. Cars passed like shadows. The boarding house loomed above him, its windows dim. He lit his pipe. Behind one of those windows, someone knew more than they were saying. Someone had been listening behind doors. Someone had walked the back stairs. Someone, somewhere in that house, had worn a green scarf that no longer hung where it should. The door wouldn't lock. But perhaps, Maigret thought, that was the point. Perhaps it had never been about the door at all. The next morning began without ceremony. The rain had ceased during the night, leaving the streets slick and dark as if still soaked in shadow. Maigret rose early. His pipe was already lit by the time Madame Maigret laid a quiet breakfast before him. She didn't speak, only gave him that look, the one she reserved for days when something in him had already travelled far ahead of his body. He didn't eat much, just a bit of bread, some coffee that went cold before he finished it. His thoughts were back on Rue Popincourt, not on the present moment, not even on the warmth of the home he always returned to with such care. Something in that building nagged at him, not in the way a brutal crime might, not with urgency or panic, but with a persistent discomfort, like a tune half-remembered or a promise broken long ago. By the time he returned to the pension, the morning had settled into a dreary grey that left everything bleached of colour. The green paint on the boarding-house door looked duller now, and the brass knob cold to the touch. Inside, the familiar warmth of old floorboards and dusty wallpaper greeted him again. The same muffled silence, like the walls were listening. Madame. Barrel was at her desk as usual, folding linen napkins into even squares. She gave him a tight smile, more formal than friendly. He returned it with a nod. "I wonder if I might see the outgoing mail you haven't sent yet," he asked, already knowing the answer. "There's only one letter today," she said. "Monsieur Letellier posted it this morning. Do you still have it?" She hesitated, then reached into a drawer and withdrew a thin envelope. Pale beige. The name is written in cramped block letters. No return address. It was addressed to a Monsieur Clemens in the 18th arrondissement. "May I?" Maigret asked. She nodded reluctantly. He didn't open it. That would come later, if needed. For now he studied the handwriting, comparing it in his mind to the entries in Dandurand's notebook. The differences were immediate. Letellier's hand was sharp, almost mechanical. Dandurand was more organic, hesitant in its rhythm. He turned it over, then slipped it into his coat. "I'll see if it gets delivered," he said. "I'll note the postage." Madame Barrel didn't argue. She seemed relieved to hand it over on. His way up the stairs, Maigret paused at each landing. He let the air of each floor speak to him, not literally, but in the creaks and groans, in the faint odours of meals cooked hours too early, in the scuffle of slippers across uneven boards. The boarding house had its routines, and routines never lied. When he reached the third floor, he knocked softly on room 7, though he knew no one would answer. It was an old habit, an acknowledgement of space, not expectation. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, letting it rest on its broken latch. Everything remained untouched, the notebook on the desk, the cup on the sill. The shoes still dry, still waiting. Maigret took a seat in the same chair and leaned back, the smell of damp wood and pipe ash surrounding him. He reopened the notebook, flipping past the repeated phrase to a page near the back. There, in a different ink, was a list of dates, each accompanied by a single initial, L, 8 entries, spaced about a week apart. The last, 2 days before Dandurand vanished. He tapped his pipe against the edge of the table, thinking. There were no initials for Frankfurt. Downstairs, the EC front door creaked, someone entering or leaving. Maigret moved to the window and watched as Estelle Morgat crossed the street toward the bakery. Her walk was slow, distracted. She had tied a red scarf loosely over her curlers and wore slippers, without shame. The rhythm of her step matched the kind of woman who no longer hurried for anyone, or who had learned through disappointment that hurrying rarely changed the outcome. He followed her later that morning, not like a policeman, but like a neighbor. She had returned, and was sitting on the front steps with a paper bag on her lap and a cigarette between her fingers. She didn't look up when he sat beside her. "I used to write letters, too," she said after a minute. Maigret didn't respond, but she went on. "To a man in Toulon. He sold chairs, I think. Wicker ones. That's what he told me, anyway." "Did he write back?" "For a while." The silence returned. "He never said goodbye," she added, then held out the bag. "Croissant?" Maigret took one, tore off a piece, and chewed it thoughtfully. "Dandurand wrote to someone in Frankfurt, every week." "Must have been a woman," she said. "Men don't write weekly for any other reason. Did you ever see him receive a reply?" "Not once." "And Letellier, he mailed something this morning." "Letellier only writes after dinner. I've seen him. Always sits with his door open, addressing the envelope under that little lamp of his. Did he change his habits?" Maigret nodded. Slightly, she shrugged. "Then something's got him nervous. Do you think he knew Dandurand?" They never spoke. "Did they observe each other?" She smiled, but it wasn't kind. "Oh, yes, like cats on the same fence. Polite, distant, watching." A dog barked in the street. Someone upstairs slammed a door. Estelle exhaled smoke and pressed her hands flat on her thighs. "I think Dandurand was afraid of something," she said. "Not someone, just the idea of something. Maybe he had a reason." "Maybe," she said. "But the kind of fear that keeps you quiet is rarely about crime. It's about shame, guilt, that sort of thing." Maigret stood, brushed off his coat. "Thank you, Madame Morgat." She didn't say goodbye. Instead, she watched a child pass on a scooter and murmured, "He never closed the door when he left. That's how I know something's wrong." Dandurand was careful. Always. Inside again, Maigret returned to the mail, slot behind Madame Barrel's desk. The box for room 7 still had a crumpled flyer wedged into it, advertising piano lessons. He removed it, but beneath it was a folded scrap of yellow paper, half tucked into the slot's groove. He unfolded it carefully. 3 words. No greeting, no signature. "Je te pardonne. I forgive you," written in the same hand as the notebook. Maigret folded the paper again, slid it into his wallet. Forgiveness was a private thing, and sometimes it arrived too late. It was nearly midday when Maigret found himself again in the office at the Quai des Orfèvres. The heat from the radiator worked too well, and the room had grown stuffy. He had opened the window slightly, enough to let the sound of traffic on the Boulevard du Palais drift in. He wasn't there to file a report, nor to speak with anyone in particular. It was simply the nearest place with quiet, a desk and a telephone. On his blotter lay 2 envelopes. One was Letellier's letter, addressed to Monsieur Clémence in the 18th arrondissement. The other was the yellow note found tucked behind Dandurand's mail slot, the one with 3 stark words written in slanted ink, "Je te pardonne." The handwriting matched that of the notebook, no question in his mind. But who had the note been for, and why had it never been sent? He dialed a number and waited. The ring took a while before it was answered. "Bureau des Postes, Parcels and Correspondence. Chief Inspector Maigret. I'm calling about outgoing letters from 43 Rue Popincourt. I understand some were regularly sent to Frankfurt." "Yes, Inspector. We've handled mail from that address for years." "Were any returned recently?" There was a pause, the sound of paper being shifted. "One letter, yes, from Monsieur L. Dandurand, returned 2 days ago. Recipient unknown at address. Do you still have it?" "Yes, it's marked for holding. Shall we send it to your office?" "Please, I'll have a clerk retrieve it." He hung up slowly. Dandurand had written to someone every week, but the last letter had come back. No one at the other end. No more recipients. And that might have been the final thread snapping in the man's fragile world. It was the kind of detail that didn't make noise, didn't scream from the page. But it was the sort that turned people inward, that made them vanish without drama. The letter arrived at his desk an hour later in a brown postal sleeve. He opened it carefully, removing the pale blue envelope inside. The handwriting matched the notebook again. The stamp was German, the return label added by the post office. No one had received it. He slid a finger along the edge and pulled out the letter. It was brief. "Clara, I'm still here, still thinking of that walk through the Altstadt. I know I said too much, or not enough. It's hard to explain a mistake once it's become who you are. I hope you're safe. I don't need forgiveness, but if you think of me, think of the good parts." He reread it twice, then placed it beside the yellow note from the mail slot. One said, "I forgive you." The other said, "I don't need forgiveness." Between the two, Maigret could sense the hollow space of a relationship that had failed long before words were ever put to paper. Somewhere someone had walked away first. Perhaps Clara. Perhaps Dandurand himself. And what remained was this strange, quiet ritual of writing to someone who was no longer there. He tucked the letter back into its envelope and rose. Outside, the street was filled with light that had finally broken through the clouds. The sun was weak, low, not yet fully committed to staying. Still, it cast faint shadows underfoot, and the breeze carried the clean scent of early spring. He returned to Rue Popincourt on foot, walking slowly, watching the people on the pavements. 2 children shared a cone of roasted chestnuts. An old woman carried a baguette under one arm and a potted plant under the other. Paris was always like this, its dramas buried under errands and errands under silences. At the pension, Madame Barel was out. The desk sat unattended, a set of keys half visible under a blotter. Maigret moved quietly past, pausing only to glance again at the mail slots. Nothing new. He made his way upstairs. Room 7 was still as he'd left it, but something had changed. The bed cover was slightly rumpled. A drawer of the small dresser sat open by half an inch. Not enough to suggest a search, just an unsettled presence. Someone had been here. He stepped across the room and pushed the drawer open fully. Inside, folded carefully among plain shirts, was another envelope. This one was not addressed. No stamp, no recipient. He opened it slowly. The page was blank except for the center line, written in the same careful, uncertain script. "You are not the one." I was afraid of. Maigret held it in his hand for a long time. There was something haunting about it, a message to no one, or to someone whose guilt had already passed, absorbed into time. He tucked the paper into his notebook and turned toward the door again. As he stepped out, a soft sound stopped him. The click of a door on the 4th floor. He went up slowly. Room 9, Letellier's room, was ajar. The green scarf was back on its peg. He knocked gently and entered. Letellier stood near the window, one hand resting on the sill. He didn't turn. "I suppose you've read it by now," he said. "Read what?" "The letter, the one I mailed this morning." "I haven't opened it." Letellier gave a small, mirthless chuckle. "Of course you haven't. You don't need to. You already know what it says. Why don't you tell me anyway?" Letellier turned now, eyes dry but tired. "I told Clemens Dandurand had left, that he wouldn't be sending any more reports, that his part was done." "Clemens? Officially he doesn't exist. He's a whisper inside the walls of a half-dead office in the Interior Ministry." Maigret was quiet. Letellier continued. "We both did something once. Something under the flag of order. He translated documents, I reviewed them, passports, names, lists. That was years ago. The war made everyone someone else. And now? Now? He couldn't forgive himself, not because of what he did, but because he thought he should have stopped it, and didn't. Did you?" Letellier didn't answer. He sat down slowly, fingers tapping the arm of the chair. He wrote to Frankfurt. She never replied. Maybe she never existed, maybe she did. Why was he afraid? He thought someone would come, not to punish him, just to name him. Maigret nodded. Letellier looked up. "Do you believe in guilt without proof?" "I believe in the kind of silence that comes after truth." They sat for a while in that silence. Outside the rain had started again, softer now, as if Paris itself were exhaling. Maigret rose to go. "He didn't run," Letellier said suddenly. "No. He went somewhere that didn't require a locked door." Maigret stepped into the hallway. The scarf swayed gently from its peg as he passed. The rain had turned to mist again, that thin kind of Paris drizzle that didn't quite fall so much. As drift, clinging to coat sleeves, resting in the curls of iron balconies, filling the air with a smell both damp and oddly clean. Maigret stood in the foyer of Pension La Pointe, his hands in the pockets of his coat, watching the water trace down the glass of the narrow front window. The house was quiet again, too quiet, that kind of stillness that had less to do with silence and more with watchfulness. The hush of a place listening to itself. He had always believed buildings absorbed the emotions of those who lived within them. Some were like wine casks, growing richer over time. Others became hollowed out, thin shells echoing guilt or grief. This one was somewhere in between. From the hallway a sudden soft clatter broke the stillness. A cup or bowl perhaps, porcelain against linoleum. Maigret turned and moved toward the source, footsteps slow but firm. It came from the communal kitchen. When he entered, he saw Estelle Morgat crouched on the floor, gathering fragments of a saucer. Her cat, a small grey creature with a white paw and a too serious face, sat on the windowsill, tail flicking with slow disapproval. "I thought you didn't drop things," Maigret said. She gave him a look, without rising. "I don't, usually." But she startled me, jumped off the counter like the stove hissed at her. Maigret looked at the cat. She had turned her back now, tail flicking still. "Is it the same cat that refused to go near room 7 yesterday?" "The same," Estelle said, gathering the last piece into her palm. "She hasn't been herself lately." Maigret crouched beside her. "Animals know when something's changed. You think that's it? That she smells something different?" Maigret didn't answer immediately. "She doesn't cross the landing anymore, does she?" Estelle shook her head. "She used to wander up and down, curl up outside Letelier's door if the sun hit it in the morning. Now she avoids the whole floor." "Have you seen anything unusual today?" "No. Only you." She rose and dropped the porcelain fragments into the bin, beneath the sink. Then she rinsed her hands, drying them on a tea towel that was too thin to be useful. "What did Letelier say?" she asked. "Enough." "Did he tell you where Dandurand went?" "No. But I think he told me why." Estelle leaned against the stove. "There was something sad about that man, but not the kind of sadness you wear like a wound. It was tucked away, polite, hidden under clean shirts and brushed shoes. He had guilt." She nodded. "But didn't we all, after the war? For what we saw, or to survive?" Maigret looked around the kitchen. The kettle on the stove had cooled but not been emptied. An old sugar tin sat open, the spoon still inside. The window was ajar, letting in a line of misty air. "Do you believe he harmed himself?" he asked gently. She looked at him, not surprised by the question. "No, but I believe he stopped trying not to." Maigret stood, pipe in hand. He didn't light it, just rolled the stem between his fingers. "You mentioned once that you saw him listening at Letelier's door." "Yes." "You never told Letelier?" "Of course not. What would I say? Your shadow has a shadow?" Maigret almost smiled. "And the scarf? What about it? You noticed it was missing?" "Yes, he always wore it. Even in July." "Do you think he gave it to Dandurand?" She paused, then shook her head. "No, I think Dandurand took it." "Why?" "To try on a life not his own, maybe. Or because he wanted someone to think he had a friend." Maigret left her there and returned to the 3rd floor. The landing was dim, the light bulb above giving off only a faint yellow halo. The wallpaper curled at the corners near the baseboard. It was the kind of place that wore its years without apology. He stopped outside room 7 again. The door had been pulled closed by someone. It might have been Letelier. It might have been Estelle. It no longer mattered. It didn't latch. It never had. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly different now, less like Dandurand, less like a man who worried about shoes and notebooks and letters not being answered, more like something resigned. The air had settled. Maigret moved slowly. He checked the dresser again, the desk drawers, the wardrobe. All as before. He sat on the edge of the bed and waited. He didn't expect someone to arrive. He simply waited for the room to speak. After a time he stood and walked to the window. The courtyard below was still. A clothesline hung slack between two posts. On the far side, the narrow back staircase curled downward like a coil of forgotten thought. He turned, back toward the bed. That's when he noticed it. A small tag, half visible beneath the corner of the mattress. He bent and pulled it free. It was a claim check. Faded. From a cloakroom. Cinéma des Trois Miroirs. Maigret frowned. The theatre had closed 6 years ago. Slipped the ticket into his coat pocket and stood again. Outside the room, the air on the landing felt colder. He walked past Letellier's room without stopping. The green scarf had vanished once more. Downstairs, Madame Barrel had returned. She was dusting the radiator with a stiff brush and humming tunelessly. She looked up at him without greeting. "Madame," he said, "did Dandurand ever leave the house in the middle of the night?" She blinked. "I don't believe so." "Did you ever hear the back door open?" She hesitated. "There's no one at the service entrance. It's locked, bolted from inside." "Still," Maigret said, "locks are strange things. Some close too easily, some never catch, some only pretend." She gave him a puzzled look, but he was already turning to leave. At the front door, the cat was sitting at the top of the stairs, one paw tucked under its chest. Maigret paused. It watched him without blinking. Behind it, the door to room 7 was still ajar. The cat did not move. Maigret stood outside the pension for a long moment before setting off. The clouds had broken slightly, casting a fragile, pallid light over Rue Popincourt. The puddles on the pavement reflected the buildings like fragile mirrors, easily shattered by passing steps. The cloakroom ticket in his pocket felt light, almost inconsequential. Yet there was something about it that wouldn't let him leave it alone. Cinéma des Trois Miroirs. The theatre had closed its doors more than half a decade ago. One of those quiet casualties of time, not scandal. It had been a place for third-run films, old dramas and newsreels, the kind of place you went to forget the hour. Cloakrooms, she recalled, were still common in such cinemas in the earlier days. People left behind hats, umbrellas, sometimes more. By the time he reached the old cinema's address, it had become a furniture showroom. The kind that looked permanent but felt temporary. Cardboard signs hung in the window, advertising discounts that never changed. Maigret entered, pipe in hand, coat still damp around the collar. A young man stood behind the counter, flipping through a furniture catalogue with a pen stuck behind his ear. He looked up with a kind of casual suspicion, the way clerks do when a man walks in without looking at the price tags. "Yes, monsieur?" "I'm not here to buy furniture," Maigret said. "I'm looking for someone who might know what this was used for." He placed the ticket on the counter. The young man leaned in, then shrugged. "That place shut before I ever started here. We've been renting the space for 3 years. Was there anything left behind?" "I wouldn't know. You'd want to talk to the owner. He keeps an office in the back." "Could I?" The young man hesitated, then nodded toward a frosted glass door behind a row of unassembled wardrobes. Inside, the air was warmer and smelled faintly of tobacco and old upholstery. The man behind the desk wore a wool waistcoat and glasses that looked too small for his face. He glanced up as Maigret entered. "You're from the police?" Maigret nodded. "Only unofficially." "I'm following a quiet thread." He handed the "Take it over." The man turned it over, frowning. "Well, that's one of ours. Late style, I'd say maybe 47 or 48. The theatre closed in. 51. There was a small fire in the projection booth. No one was hurt. But it gave the city the excuse they'd been waiting for. Attendance was already down. "Do you recall anything being left behind in the cloakroom? Items unclaimed?" The man's brow furrowed. "Well, there were always a few. Scarves, gloves. Given a violin case, believe it or not." "A violin case? Yes, never claimed." No instrument inside, just some papers. I think we gave it to the Municipal Lost Property Office. And the rest? A few trunks, some hats, but nothing of value. Most of it was cleared out. Maigret tapped his pipe absently against the edge of the desk. What about the cloakroom ledger? The man blinked. I might have that. We kept it mostly for inventory, not for names. He rose and began sifting through a filing cabinet, grunting softly as he moved folders that hadn't been touched in years. Finally, he pulled out a battered black notebook and brought it to the desk. The pages were yellowed and filled with tight pencil marks. He flipped to the section labeled Cloakroom Receipts, late 1940s. Maigret leaned in. There, scribbled next to the number on the stub in his pocket, was a simple entry. Small parcel. Owner, LD, no other information. LD. Maigret said aloud, Yes, could be anything. Do you think it was your man? I do. What was in the parcel? That's what I intend to find out. He thanked the man and left the building. On the street again, he considered his options. The Municipal Lost Property Office wouldn't keep unclaimed items this long, not unless they were considered of historical or legal interest. But there was one man in records who owed Maigret a favor, and more importantly, had an obsessive tendency to never throw anything away. He walked. It was a habit of his, letting thoughts settle through the soles of his shoes. The Office of Lost Property sat near the Gare de Lyon, housed in an unremarkable annex of municipal administration, painted the same dull cream as every other office of its kind. The records clerk, Monsieur Poirot, was exactly where Maigret had last seen him. His tie crooked, his spectacles fogged slightly from the steam of his lunchtime soup. Chief Inspector. Poirot stood and extended a bony hand. I haven't seen you in ages. Still solving crimes in your sleep? Something quieter this time, Maigret replied. I'm looking for a parcel that may have come in around 1951, from the Cinéma des Trois Miroirs. Owner's initials, LD. Poirot tilted his head, thinking. That was the year we did the big shuffle. Old tags, old boxes. Most were purged, but... He disappeared into a back room, trailing silence. Maigret waited. There were no other visitors, just a flickering light bulb and the faint tick of a clock that no longer kept accurate time. After several minutes, Poirot returned with a faded cardboard box, edges taped and retaped. Found it. Under unsorted, only because the handwriting matched something else we flagged years ago. Never claimed. Maigret opened it slowly. Inside was a man's leather wallet, cracked with age, containing an expired identity card issued under the name Lucien Dandurand. There was also a woman's handkerchief, embroidered, fine linen, and a photograph. The photo showed two people standing before a building in Frankfurt. The man was young, clean-shaven, wearing a coat too large for his frame. The woman beside him wore gloves and a smile that did not reach her eyes. On the back, in the same slanted handwriting as the letters, Clara, 1943. Maigret replaced the items and closed the lid gently. He left the building with the box under one arm. Back at the pension, the evening had drawn down. Letellier was not in his room. Estelle Morgat was nowhere to be seen. But the cat had moved. It now sat halfway across the third-floor landing, just beside the door to room 7, watching, waiting. Maigret walked past it and opened the door to the room again. The light was pale, touched with sunset. He placed the box on the bed, and for the first time since Dandurand's disappearance, the room no longer felt waiting. It felt like a memory. The photograph lay flat on the bedspread, the edges curling slightly with age. Maigret sat across from it in the wooden chair near the window, pipe idle in his hand. He had not lit it. He didn't need to. The scent of the old room, mingled with the faint lavender left behind by the handkerchief in the parcel, was enough to keep him still. The light through the window had softened into late evening, turning the greys of the room into warmer browns. It made the face in the photograph glow faintly, as though lit by memory rather than sunlight. Clara. The woman beside the young Dandurand in the image. Maigret studied her features again. She was not conventionally beautiful, but there was a quiet intensity to her eyes, as though she was holding in more than anyone had ever asked her to. Her posture was stiff, her smile composed. She stood close to Dandurand, but not with intimacy. There was something guarded about it, like they belonged to the same tragedy rather than the same affection. The building behind them, somewhere in Frankfurt, was not distinctive, but the date written on the back, 1943, made everything heavier. What had happened between them, more precisely? What had happened afterward? Maigret tucked the photograph back into the envelope and slid it into the box once more. He closed the lid slowly, not with ceremony but with care. Then he rose, stepped out of room 7 and left the door slightly ajar, as it always seemed to be. The cat still lingered in the hallway, watching. Letellier's door was open. Maigret paused, then stepped inside without knocking. Letellier sat by the window, green scarf back around his neck, staring out into the growing darkness. "I thought you'd come," he said, not turning. "You've seen the photograph?" Letellier nodded. "Yes." "She meant something to you?" "She meant something to both of us." Maigret moved slowly, easing into the chair opposite. "She's the reason he stopped speaking, isn't she?" Letellier nodded again, this time slower. "You have to understand something, Maigret. We were boys when we met her, not in age but in experience. Everything that followed, it made us older than we should have been. You were stationed there during the occupation." Letellier allowed a smile, barely visible. "Yes. Dandurand was a translator. I was a record officer. We both lived in the same building, shared cheap wine, long cigarettes, and silences. Clara lived 2 doors down. She was different. Not what the war expected of a woman." "In what way?" "She had opinions. She spoke French. Badly, but with precision. And she never begged. Not even when there were rations. She traded in dignity, her own and others. We admired her for that." "And what happened?" Letellier's eyes didn't leave the window. "She asked for a favor one day. Quietly. A cousin, she said, was on a list. We had seen that name. Dandurand asked me to strike it. I could have, but I hesitated. There were checks, protocols, threats behind the paper. It was cowardice, perhaps. I told him no. He didn't argue, but he did it anyway. I think he hoped she'd never find out. But she did. She did. And she stopped speaking to him. 2 weeks before she disappeared. We never saw her again. No knock, no door ajar. Just silence. And he never forgave himself. No. Maigret was quiet for a long time. "Did you?" Letellier shrugged. "I forgave myself too quickly. That's a different crime." Maigret looked around the room. It was sparse, orderly. Nothing here suggested longing or loss, yet it clung to Letellier like a second coat. "Why didn't you say any of this sooner?" "Because Dandurand didn't want it spoken. He believed in consequences. He believed some stories were meant to remain quiet. And yet, he left the ticket. The parcel." Letellier finally turned from the window. His eyes were not red, not wet, but dulled, as though some part of him had closed for the day and would not reopen until morning. He left them where they could be found, not by just anyone, by someone who might understand that guilt is not always resolved through confession. Sometimes it just has to be seen. "And what would you have me do with it?" "Nothing." Maigret nodded. You don't believe he's dead, do you? Letellier hesitated. No, but I don't believe he'll return either. He's not hiding. He's living differently, quietly, without language. Maigret stood. He moved to the door, then paused. Do you believe Clara ever forgave him? Letellier shook his head. It doesn't matter. He forgave her. Maigret stepped out and closed the door behind him. The hallway was darker now. A bulb had burned. Out at the far end, leaving only the dim flicker of a sconce above the staircase. The cat was gone. The pension had returned to its usual stillness. Back downstairs, Madame Barel was winding the clock on the wall, its brass pendulum swinging lazily. In the glass, any news? She asked softly. Maigret slipped on his coat. Only stories. All the facts have already left. She looked at him for a long moment, then returned to the clock, tightening the key with a slow, patient motion. Maigret stepped outside. The rain had returned just barely, a mist more than a shower. He lit his pipe at last, the smoke rising lazily into the soft night air. At the corner, the café was still open. He could see Estelle Maigret inside, seated alone, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. He did not go in. He walked on, and behind him, somewhere up on the third floor of the pension, the door to room 7 hung silently ajar, not quite closed, not quite open. The morning came softly with the pale light of a sky still uncertain about the day it wished to become. Maigret awoke earlier than usual, though he had slept deeply. Not from resolution, but from weariness, the kind that comes only after a long evening of quiet truths. He sat at the breakfast table in his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the usual pipe resting on the edge of the ashtray, smoke rising in thin, lazy spirals. Madame Maigret had left for the market. A note beside the pot of coffee said she would return with radishes and lamb shoulder. He reread it once, smiled faintly, and poured himself a cup. Outside, the street below began to fill with life. The sound of a distant tram bell, the creak of a fruit cart's wooden wheels, the hurried steps of a man late for work and somewhere, the bark of a dog too proud for its leash. He thought of Dandurand, not as he had known him through scattered objects and quiet rooms, but as he must have once been, young, watchful, idealistic, and clinging to language like a raft. A man who had learned to read between words, but had perhaps forgotten how to speak directly. A man who, somewhere along the years, had slipped from translation into erasure. By 10 o'clock, Maigret was walking again through the streets of the 11th arrondissement. The city smelled of wet stone and bakery yeast. The world continued to live on, regardless of how many names went unspoken. He wasn't returning to Rue Popincourt that morning. Not immediately. Instead, he turned off Rue de la Roquette and entered a building with no sign. Inside was a modest office, records and residency, one of the small bureaucratic chambers where the city kept track of lives that were supposed to be traceable. Not many people visited in person anymore. A woman with horn-rimmed glasses sat behind the desk. She looked up from a crossword puzzle with mild interest. Yes? I'm looking into the former residence of Monsieur Lucien Dandurand, Rue Popincourt, room 7 boarding house. She nodded and began typing into a creaking keyboard that sounded older than the building itself. No forwarding address, she said after a pause. He officially vacated yesterday. Not unusual. These places sometimes report vacated rooms before they're actually cleaned out. No next of kin? No contact listed? None. Anything prior to Rue Popincourt? She scrolled through the screen, lips pursed. Only a single rental listing before that. Rue Mornay, 1952. Then nothing for decades. Just a blank span until the boarding house in 59. Maigret raised an eyebrow. Nothing at all. Not in the books, anyway. He nodded, thanked her, and stepped back into the cool air. It confirmed something he had begun to suspect. Dandurand had never lived in the city in any normal way. He had drifted or hidden or existed between records, not for criminal reasons. There was no fear in the silence of his life, just privacy so deep it became indistinguishable from vanishing. By the time Maigret returned to Rue Popincourt, the rain had come again. Just a light mist, enough to keep the streets gleaming and the rooftops dark with damp. He entered the pension and climbed the stairs slowly, letting the rhythm of his steps mark his presence. On the third floor the cat was gone. Room 7 was still ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside one last time. The room was being emptied. Madame Barrel was there with a bucket and cloth, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a frown of effort on her brow. She turned as he entered. "I didn't expect you today, Inspector." "I didn't expect myself either." She returned to scrubbing the baseboard. "It's strange he didn't leave much. Everything fits into 2 boxes. Maigret walked to the window. The rain had softened again. "Did he ever say goodbye?" She hesitated, wringing the cloth. "Not really. Just said he might be away a few days. Asked if I'd hold his letters if any arrived." "You think he'll come back?" "No." She didn't sound bitter, just resigned. Maigret turned. "Do you know who Clara was?" The old concierge stiffened slightly. "I've heard the name," she said. "Once. I came in early. He was at the door, fumbling with a letter. He dropped it. I handed it back. He smiled and said, 'It's for Clara. She'll never read it, but I write them anyway.' Did he ever send them?" "Once a week, like prayers." Maigret moved to the desk. The notebook was still there. He flipped through the last few pages. Blank. He closed it gently. "I'd like to take the boxes," he said, "for the record." "Of course." She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and left him alone. He stood there a moment longer, not searching, not deducing, just listening to the room. It was quiet now, not expectant, not unsettled. Only still. He picked up the 2 boxes and made his way downstairs. At the door he turned back. "Madame Barrel?" "Yes, Inspector. If a man disappears but leaves everything behind, is he still missing?" She smiled, the way people do when they know an answer that can't be explained, only if someone's looking for him. Maigret nodded and stepped outside. He walked to the nearest café and placed the boxes beside his chair. The waiter recognized him and brought a coffee without asking. The rain tapped the awning gently overhead. He opened the first box. Inside were the small items of Dandurand's life: his shaving brush, a few shirts, a pipe never smoked. The second box held the letters, all unsent, all addressed to Clara. He picked one at random and read it. There were no confessions, no revelations, just small thoughts, fragments of books he had read, meals he had prepared, moments of silence he wished she could have shared. Maigret finished his coffee and sat back. In a world of noise, Dandurand had chosen quiet, and in choosing it, he had finally left, not through flight, nor fear, nor death, but through distance, the kind that cannot be measured in kilometers, only in silence. There would be no arrest, no file marked case closed, but there would be understanding, and that, Maigret knew, was often the only justice the world was capable of. The next day, Paris awoke to a steadier rain. Not the misty drizzle of the past few mornings, but a slow, persistent downpour that gave everything the hue of old pewter. Drops slid down cafe windows like tears left too long, and the gutters hummed with quiet rivers. On Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the sycamores swayed slightly, their leaves heavy with water, the bark dark and soaked. Chief Inspector Maigret sat in the corner of a café just off Rue Saint-Antoine, not far from the Seine. The boxes from Dandurand's A room had been returned to his office at the Quai des Orfèvres for documentation, though he had left no instructions to investigate further. They were not evidence of a crime. They were fragments of a life, quiet, unobtrusive, and now gently closed. He stirred his coffee absently, not drinking, simply listening to the sound of the world continuing outside the rain-streaked window. Somewhere behind him, a radio murmured an old chanson. Across the room, a waiter dried glasses without hurry. It was a slow day, a day made for remembering. Maigret pulled the photograph from his coat pocket once more. Clara and Dandurand. Frankfurt, 1943. He had studied the image enough now to notice the smallest details. The way Dandurand's left hand curled slightly inward, as though resisting a gesture he dared not make. The way Clara's gloves were folded in her right hand, not worn. The sliver of sunlight catching her cheek just before her expression hardened into permanence. They had stood together but never belonged to each other. That much was clear, and yet Dandurand had kept the image, folded carefully in the box he never intended to retrieve. Had written her name 100 times. Had mailed letters. Into silence. Maigret wondered what she had become, if she had become at all. She might have married, changed her name, left Germany, or vanished without leaving a note, just as Dandurand had. The war had scattered people like papers in the wind. Some had been collected again, others had not. A thought came to him, not with urgency, but with a slow insistence. He left the cafe and walked toward the river, turning eventually onto a side street where the old Jewish archives had been relocated. A modest building now, more digital than paper, but still holding records others had long forgotten. He gave the name Clara, no surname, and the year 1943. A clerk with a tired face and delicate fingers typed without speaking. After 10 minutes, she shook her head. No match? Too many. Clara is not uncommon, unless you have more. Maigret did not. He thanked her and stepped outside. The rain had eased, just slightly. He walked the embankment, his pipe unlit, the box of matches unopened in his pocket. He didn't need smoke. He needed time. By early afternoon he found himself again on Rue Popincourt. He had not intended to return, and yet his feet had brought him there, in the way they always did when a case had not entirely left his blood. Not a case, perhaps, more a presence. Inside the pension, Madame Barrel sat behind the desk, a crossword folded in half before her. The pen idle. Inspector, she said, as though she had expected him all morning. Madame, so room 7 has been taken. Oh? A young man, student, studies film theory. Didn't ask about the lock. Maigret nodded. Sometimes the door that won't close is the safest kind. She smiled faintly. He glanced at the stairs but did not climb them. Letellier? Still here. Quiet. And Madame Morgat? She's taken a singing job in Montreuil, twice a week. Seems pleased. Maigret leaned on the edge of the desk. Would you mind if I sat for a moment in the courtyard? Of course not, it's always open. The courtyard was narrow, its tiles slick with rain. A few iron chairs stood around a rusting table, potted. Plants sagged under the weight of too much water. He sat in the corner beneath the eaves, where a small leak tapped rhythmically into an old saucer. The pension felt different now. Not lighter, not brighter, but settled, as though it had exhaled. Above, a window creaked open. Letellier leaned out slightly, a book in one hand. He saw Maigret and nodded, then disappeared again. No words. No need. The rain began again in earnest. Maigret sat with his coat buttoned and his hat tipped forward. He watched the drops strike the puddles, then vanish. He thought about guilt and what people do with it. Some bury it, some carry it. Some, like Dandurand, turn it into language. Letter after letter, word after word, a kind of penance made of ink and distance, and Maigret, who had seen murderers cry at the wrong time and liars faint from their own. Fiction knew something about that kind of guilt, the quiet kind. The kind that had no courtroom, no verdict, no punishment, only memory. He would not pursue Dandurand. There was no crime to solve. The man had gone where the city could no longer follow, perhaps to a village along the coast, perhaps inland, to a rented room where no one knew his name. Or perhaps nowhere at all, only into the kind of silence that closes like a fog and leaves no trail. The real story was already told in letters not sent. In a door that would not lock, in a photograph meant to be found. He stood finally, stretched his legs, and nodded to the pension as though it were a person he respected. Then he stepped out into the street. The rain continued. Paris went on, and somewhere in a room no longer his, the ghost of a man who had chosen silence no longer needed to be watched.